y'all, it's Kay from the Literary Apothecary and welcome back to my channel. So now that we are in July and we're halfway through 2023, I thought this would be the perfect time to check in on my top 10-ish favorite reads that I've had so far this year. And just through process of elimination, I've kept this to one book per author and one book per series. So I'm gonna try to give a spoiler-free summary of the book, my thoughts on it, and what I thought that the author does really well. Some of these are books that are mid-series, and so I can't give quite as good of a summary without giving away the books before that, so you'll see that as we go through. I will link all of my reviews for books that I had dedicated reviews for in the description below, as well as any author conversations that I've had for some of these self-pub books. So just wanted to add that in there. These are in literally no order at all. I originally started writing them in the order of how I finished because I was going through my reading spreadsheet. And then I would cross one off to insert another one and cross another one off to insert that one. So it ended up even being no order at all. But the first book we're going to be talking about is The Fifth Elephant by Terry Pratchett. This is book 5 in the City Watch series, part of the Discworld universe. In here, we get Sam Vimes out of his element, out of Ankh-Morpork, and this is the first time that we really get to see Sybil shine on the page, and I just absolutely love Lady Sybil. So when I read this book and Lady Sybil just shone through the page, it immediately became a favorite of mine. Terry Pratchett is not only great in creating these characters and writing about social commentary in his fantasy world, but also imbibing humor into his fantasy. And anytime I need a palate cleanser and a laugh, I pick up a Terry Pratchett book. Next up, we have The Bleeding Stone by Joseph John Lee. Now, this is a self-pub SPFBO book. It's a historical indigenous fantasy book, book 1 in the Spellbinders and Gunslingers series. It's basically a tale of those who were conquered in America when Columbus and gang came, but also a tale of how they fought. Oftentimes we get, they say that history is told by the victors, but in this case, history is told by the losers. And things that I loved in The Bleeding Stone, we've got fantastic characters that I still think about today, 4 months after I finished reading this book. They felt like real life people plucked from history. You got well-written prose, easily imagined scenes, which is important for me as a reader, and Joseph John Lee imbibes emotion into his storytelling. You get this fantastic story with great storytelling techniques, with all of the emotions poured into it, and I can't wait to continue this series. I know I've got to catch up on book 2, I think it is, and also the prequel novella before book 3 comes out next year. But you better believe I'm going to be reading all of the books that Joseph John Lee puts out, because I absolutely loved The Bleeding Stone and I cannot talk enough good things about this book. Next up, we have a little bit of a shift in focus, Imperium by Robert Harris. This is a historical fiction book, book 1 in the Cicero trilogy, and you get courtroom drama in ancient Rome in this book. It's a recreation of Tiro's vanished masterpiece, recounting in vivid detail the story of Cicero's quest for glory, competing with some of the most powerful and intimidating figures of his age or basically history in itself. You've got Pompey, you've got Caesar, Julius Caesar, and Crassus. Some of the most intimidating men in definitely ancient Roman history, but all of history really. And Robert Harris is fantastic at writing villains. No matter who the villain is on the page, you can't help but hate them. He does such a great job of that. And part of the reason why his villains are so good is because he uses so many emotions in his writing. You're gonna sense a theme here with emotional writing for me. That is a mark of a truly, truly amazing book, is when I can feel all of the emotions that our characters are feeling. And Imperium by Robert Harris definitely has that, especially in Cicero's speeches. You just get all of that emotion through on the page, and I highly recommend Imperium by Robert Harris. It's a trilogy. Book 1 and Book 2 were amazing. Book 3 was not quite as good for me, but still well worth the read. And also, up we have The Two-Faced Queen by Nick Martell. Now this is one of those books that I can't really give a good summary for because it's book 2 and is the Legacy of the Mercenary Kings trilogy, and if I mentioned really anything about details about what's in this book, it gives away spoilers for book 1. So this is a dark fantasy, definitely dark, definitely fantasy. This book completely blew my mind. In my point of view, the best book in the series, though book 1 is really close behind that. I binged the last 50% of this book in 24 hours, and this was a 500 plus page book. So that just gives you an idea of how good it was. All hell breaks loose in the Hollows. And that's basically my summary for this book without giving away any spoilers for either this book or book 1. Just all hell breaks loose, and our characters have to deal with it and figure out how to move on and how to deal with life and chaos. The prose was extremely well written. It was accessible and easy to read, and the pacing was spot on for this book, the events that happened in this book, and our characters that we have. I can't talk enough about the Legacy of the Mercenary Kings trilogy by Nick Martell. He has become an auto-buy author for me. I will read anything that he writes. Can't wait to see what else he has in store for us. Next up is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Of course, this is book 3 in A Song of Ice and Fire series. We've got high fantasy, dark fantasy, grimdark even, if you want to go there. This one starts where book 2 ends, but in different points of view. So we get the same events from the end of book 2, but in different points of view than we had there, which I absolutely love that technique. And we got a little note from George R. R. Martin at the beginning saying that, you know, he wanted to do this and this is what happened. One of the best books I've ever read. The ending had my head absolutely spinning. I was completely blown away. And in this book, this is where we got to see the core of our characters start to leak through on the page. Whose side are they really on? Who are we supposed to be rooting for in this series? And of course, George R. R. Martin's world building is a masterclass in world building. He has a way of making his Westeros world feel both ginormous but also intricately connected together, both big and small all at the same time. And I don't know how you do that, but he does it masterfully. Also, his characters, you can't get better than George R. R. Martin's characters. His characters are absolutely unbelievable. some of my favorite characters I've ever read. So going along with the grimdark theme, the next book up is Buzzard's Bowl by John Palladino. This is book 2 in the Tragedy of Sedan series, and y'all, this book was so good. I wasn't sure how good this book was going to be because I thought maybe it'll have second book syndrome. The first book was just so good. I thought, how can we get better than this? But what John Palladino did was he took everything from the Trials of Ashmount and improved on it, made it better. He dug deep in with his characters and really got to the core of the characters and who they are and what they made them. The plot progressed perfectly, had great pace, world building was fantastic, character development was on point. Just everything about this book, I would not change anything about it. And it made me love a certain animal. It made me grieve for a certain character that I did not expect. I read Trials of Ashmount earlier this year for a self-pub Sunday, and then I think like 2 months later or a month later, the Buzzard's Bowl was ready for ARCs. I got an ARC copy of it. It came out the next month after that, and y'all, it was just so good. Definitely one of the top in my top 10. Next up, we're going from grimdark to urban fantasy, so a little grit in with our fantasy, but also a little humor with Storefront by Jim Butcher. This is book 1 in the Dresden series, and this series has become like book candy to me. I can't get enough of it. I want more, I need more, and it's just so good. Harry Dresden is the one and only wizard in Chicago, and he helps the police department solve impossible or improbable cases. I was honestly shocked with how much I love this book. I knew I would like it because Leslie at the Nerdy Narrative is absolutely obsessed with it, and we usually have very similar reading tastes, but I did not expect to love this series as much as I did. The pacing, both the text and the audiobook, was done perfectly. Our characters were entertaining, our plot was engaging, and what Jim Butcher does especially well is the grit and sarcastic humor. It's a great palate cleanser, and I can't say enough about the Dresden Files series. I know people say that the series only gets better as you go on. They said book 1, book 2, even book 3 are its weakest books, but I absolutely loved it from the start, so I can't wait to continue. I have book 3 on my possible TBR this month in July, and I can't wait to get to it. So from urban fantasy, we go to a historical fiction musical mystery in Symphony of Secrets by Brendan Slocum. Now, that other name might be familiar if you watched me last year on my channel. I talked about The Violent Conspiracy. This year we've got Symphony of Secrets, and y'all, this book is so good. This is actually the only book on this list that I didn't give a full 5 stars for, and if you watch my review for this book, you'll see why I didn't give 5 stars, but that just shows you just how good it is. It didn't even get 5 stars, and it's still one of my top 10 favorite reads so far this year. In Symphony of Secrets, we have a dual timeline going on here. In the present tense, we're in New York City. We've got a Delaney scholar who's hired to authenticate and prepare a famous lost opera, but along the way, he discovers a mystery about it. In the past, we have Frederick Delaney and Josephine Baker creating the masterpiece that Byrne, our future scholar, knows so well. Josephine stole the show for me. She is one of the best characters I've read this year, and by far Brendan Slocum's best character that we've seen so far. His characters are so realistic that after I finished Symphony of Secrets, I went and I tried to find more information and more books about Frederick Delaney and Josephine Baker, and they don't exist because they're not real people. They might be based off of real people, I don't know about that, but those characters themselves, under those names and those occupations, do not exist in history. That's how good Brendan Slocum is at creating believable characters. Also, his musical integrations into the plot in this book were done spectacularly. You do not need to know a single thing about music in order to read and enjoy this book. I barely know anything about music, and I loved this book. Only a couple more left. We've got A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. This is my most recent literary obsession. This is a fantasy romance mystery with a little bit of maybe horror in there. This is book 1 in the Elements of Cadence series, and I loved everything about this book. It's a magical fantasy with a dark mystery at the core. It takes place in Scotland. Y'all know that's a keyword for me. And it's got beautiful, enchanting, engaging prose with realistic characters and landscape. It felt both realistic and magical to me. But what Rebecca Ross does best, in my opinion, is her atmosphere. She creates such an atmosphere that you can't help but get sucked into the story and feel like you're part of it and experiencing it along with the characters. I highly recommend doing an immersion read with this. I read the physical copy that I got from Book of the Month like last year, I think it was, early last year, along with the audiobook, and it just put me straight in that atmosphere, straight in that mood. It was fantastic. Next up, we have Wistful Ascending by J.C.M. Byrne. This is another self-pub book I read for Self-Pub Sundays, and y'all, I absolutely loved everything about this superhero space opera. You will not hear me stop talking about this book. At 32, Rohan, half human, full superhero, retires to Wistful, a vast, sentient, independent space station, to try to live a normal life. With a steady job, someone far out of his league to date, and the most cosmopolitan selection of fine dining in the sector, life is good. Then a long, dormant wormhole is opened by a ship full of refugees that then sets off a chain of events that will force Rohan to confront his checkered past and cast doubt on whether he can leave behind his violent warrior heritage. What J.C.M. Byrne does best in Wistful Ascending is his characters are absolutely amazing. They're fantastic characters. The humor that he brings into this space opera sets it above other space operas that are so serious. It does not take itself serious at all, but it is also kind of a serious story because we've got these wormholes in space, and the third thing, space bears. Who ever thought of space bears? J.C.M. Byrne. Now, the last book I have on my list is an honorable mention because yes, we have reached the 10 books. This one is an honorable mention because it was so unique to me that I had to mention it. I couldn't let it go. And that is the SKy Revolt by Baptiste Pinson Wu. This is book 1 in the Three Kingdoms Chronicle, a historical military fiction book. And y'all, this book was so fantastic. It's a war tale told by the losers of the war in 184 CE China, so ancient China. And this is unique because oftentimes, you know, history is told by the victors, but sometimes it's told by the losers. And B, a historical fiction not dealing with the US or like Europe with the UK is hard to find sometimes. And what Wu does well in the SKy Revolt is he gives us great battle scenes. We get so much compassion in his characters. All of his characters have great compassion in them. And it's just fantastic storytelling. It's just a really, really well-written book that I couldn't leave off this list. So that's my top 10-ish favorite reads so far this year in 2023. Let me know in the comments below, what's your favorite read from this year so far? If you've read any of these books that I mentioned here, let me know in the comments below what you thought of them. As always, my Patreon and my Discord information will be in the description below. Keep reading, and I love y'all to the moon and back. Bye.